What can I say, folks? Sometimes the worst is more enjoyable to talk about than the best. Strap in, folks. This is my top 10 worst books of 2023. But before we begin, allow me to remind you of the rules. This will apply to both the best and the worst, but I think I've already published the best by now. Rule number 1. I must have read the book for the first time in 2023. This means, as much as I hated Daniel X on a reread, it's officially disqualified from the ranking on the list, because I had actually read it years before and was merely revisiting it to my nostalgia month, much to my horror. That being said, it will definitely make a dishonorable mention. It does also mean, however, that the book doesn't have to have come out during the year 2023, which is also good because I am always so far behind the times when it comes to new releases. The second will be that this list is about books. So even if I might have read a revolting short story sometime this month, or been terrorized by some awful comics or mangas, I cannot include it because it has to be a novel. And finally, I have to have finished the book to include it on this list. So, as much as I was just tormented by Yuma's crime wave, seeing as I never actually finished it because of how bad it was, I can't in good conscience put it on this list because, for all I know, after the chapter I read, it will suddenly become the best book I ever read. I really doubt it, but it's possible. So, without further ado, we have a lot to trudge through. So let's get this show on the road, and we'll get into the top 10 worst books. Starting with number 10. The Host by Stephanie Meyers. I imagine it doesn't surprise a lot of you to see a Stephanie Meyer book on the worst of list. But honestly, I kind of wish I didn't have to put this here, because this book was pretty close to even being on my top 10 books of 2023. But it ultimately just failed in its closing acts. It's a book that has a lot of interesting ideas and themes that swirl around in it, but Maya chooses to never pursue any of them. She instead goes for the lowest common denominator of those themes and narratives. She stuck to what she was comfortable with in the long run and ruined a lot of things she could have done that would have really made this book stick. Made it a good, interesting read that has something to say instead of just being its boring slog about really uncomfortable age gap romances. And that's why this book is number 10 on the list. Because although I didn't hate this book, I hated all the wasted potential of this book. There was so much she could have done and said with it, but again, she just sacrificed it to do what she'd already done before. I wish it had been better. I wish it could have gone on the best books, but it wasn't. And as such, it's number 10. Number 9. The Bookshop and the Barbarian by Morgan Stang. This book was like someone wrote a children's novel then aimed it at a much higher age bracket. With juvenile plot lines and humor, very little chemistry between the characters and its romance, or even just as a friendship, and a world that exists solely around the comedy, it's ultimately a chore just to get through it at times. The villains were disappointing, and even the D&D references made were both unimpressive and showed a total lack of awareness of just what they're referencing. Maybe all of that could have been forgivable, but even the narrative was a boring slog. The comedy failed to make me laugh, and yeah, several of the problems in the book just felt forced, and then received an equally forced solution. Overall, I don't think this was really worth the few hours it took to read it. Honestly, this book alone has caused me to start thinking if cozy stories are really this bad, maybe the cozy genre is just not for me, because it honestly feels like cozy is just becoming synonymous for the word boring. That being said, because it's a comedy, it's only being ranked as number 9. Comedy is one of the most subjective genres out there, and because of that, whereas I didn't like the book, I can in good conscience put it lower, because there may be people who go out there and find this book hilarious. Maybe you'll laugh out loud when you read this book, and you'll think it's much better than I did. And if you do, I'm glad. But for me, no. Number 8. Wardens of Eternity by Courtney Moulton. Another book that made it onto one of my minor TBR reviews, but didn't deserve an entire review to itself, Wardens of Eternity is like one of those Asylum ripoff movies, but for Percy Jackson and the Olympians, using Egyptian mythology instead of Greek mythology. With a protagonist that was sort of a Mary Sue at times. Actually, I don't say at times. She pretty much was. She had a god at her beck and call almost from the get-go. She learned in weeks what takes other characters years to learn, and she was doing it better. She's this ultimate person of prophecy, even though it doesn't make sense. Overall, it took what could have been a nice, interesting premise and ultimately just made it one of those bad books. Like, I imagine if I was a lot younger, this book would have been a lot more interesting, but instead it was just a case of reading a boring book. There was nothing exciting about it. The character was too overpowered. The plot line was too predictable. All in all, it just really wasn't worth the read. Number 7. Frozen by Cruz and Johnston. Frozen by Cruz and Johnston is one of those books that, when I initially read it and finished it, my reaction can be summed up with a resounding meh. I didn't hate it, but I certainly didn't like it either. It felt like I had read a book that I would have enjoyed as a kid, but now it did nothing to tickle my fiction fancy in the slightest. And then when I started to dissect the book for the review, I realized just how much I disliked it. So much so that, again, I brought in an actual English major to comment on how bad the book was written, on a technical sense. Because it was written bad in pretty much every way possible. Narrative, setting, even its technical abilities. And while I'm sure there are authors, or even just author, if we want to weed out one of the duo, might have greater works under their belts, with which their bibliographies seem to suggest, it didn't excuse just how poorly this book was written. And that's holding back on how confused the story is, even just ignoring all the technical aspects that were just wrong. You got a book that both wants to aggressively be a young adult book, but also wants to be an adult work at the same time, trying to walk between them, but in the end just creating a world and story that doesn't make sense under any sort of scrutiny. So as a number 7, it's not very good. Number 6. How to Marry Keanu Reeves in 90 Days by K.M. Jackson. How to Marry Keanu Reeves in 90 Days was a book I was very excited to read this year, having picked it up sometime in 2022 and waiting for the month of love to properly dig into it. Promising a romantic comedy involving one of my favorite celebrities as at least an important narrative element, along with some gorgeous cover art, I was honestly ready to love this book. And what I was met with just honestly was not worth any of the hype and excitement I had for it. A book that is both eager to be adult, making vibrator jokes in the first 20 pages, but with a story that's so clearly meant for a juvenile audience. How to Marry Keanu Reeves was an uncomfortable experience of watching a woman in her mid-40s obsess over a real-life celebrity in the same way a 14-year-old teenager would. I called this book the equivalent of reading a self-insert fanfiction in my review, and I stand by that critique. Not just based on the premise alone, but with just how the world this character lives in bows down to her. Just the general self-obsession that the main character has, and the juvenile view of the world and what is meant to be a book for adults, just ultimately rubbed me the wrong way. In addition, even without that, I find the main character's goal a little uncomfortable, being so obsessed with a celebrity that you have a panic attack at the mention of them getting married. From a tabloid news story, by the way. I didn't mention that, but there was a tabloid news story in the book. And set out on a quest to basically sabotage their marriage. It's an uncomfortable book it's only funny because it only tries to be funny because it's a female protagonist instead of a male protagonist. I know I say I don't like to play this very often, but play reverse the genders in this book. The book sounds a lot more uncomfortable if we're talking about a male so obsessed with a female celebrity that he sets out to sabotage her marriage. All in all, it just wasn't worth any of the internal hype I gave myself for this work, and I really wish I had chosen something else for the spot. Number 5. Melancholy Magic by Millie Thorne! Melancholy Magic by Millie Thorne is an exercise in frustration. A cozy paranormal mystery, Melancholy Magic is the story of a woman who's a literal living lie detector moving to a new town where she inherited a hardware store and a new manor. Only twist, neither are in good shape, and it looks like someone's been breaking into her manor to steal things from it, with the new occupant doing nothing to deter them. To call Melancholy Magic a mystery, or even a paranormal theme book, is to give it too much credit as far as I'm concerned. The mystery is limp, and Briley Scott, our main character, barely does any form of investigating herself until the very final hours. And the paranormal aspect has no weight on the plot in the slightest, constantly having the rules of how it works change just so the story can keep going, and existing as a thing that's there, but not factoring into the plot at all. I mean, as a living lie detector, you would think, or at least our main protagonist would figure out that investigating the robbery should be easy for herself and she'd want to get it quickly out of the way as soon as possible, right? But no. And that's not even the worst of it. This book is poorly written too. For example, one of the most frustrating things I've ever read in a book is the fact that this book, two characters have the exact same conversation 3 times in the book. Each time, the same points are had and the same conclusion is reached, and each time nothing comes of it. It's the literary equivalent of treading water. There are scenes in this book where a character will start to do something, then immediately turn around and do the exact opposite thing for no reason. Our main character, who is apparently the star in her own cozy mystery novels, has a literal magical empathetic power, also can't put together even the most simplest mysteries even when it's screamingly obvious. Overall, this book is just so not worth the read, and I hope the sequel isn't as bad either. Number 4. Orc and Her Bride by Lila Gwyn. Orc and Her Bride by Lila Gwyn, in theory, should have never made it near the list. Picked up during the month of June as a light, fluffy read in between my other books, Orc and Her Bride really taught me how you can truly make an unlikable protagonist. The story of an elvish princess being placed in an arranged marriage with an orcish princess of the neighboring kingdom, and then slowly learning to love each other, is exactly the kind of fluffy material I expected from this book. Only our elvish princess Elkith was such a literal terror throughout the first half of the book, I had absolutely no investment when it came to a happy outcome for her. In my review, I didn't joke when I said Elkith angered me so much that she actually interrupted my sleep, because the fiery rage I had toward her actually kept me up well past when I should have been sleeping. The worst part is, her actions might have been sympathetic if the author had, ironically, fallen a bit more on cliché, but her own desire to subvert things for the sake of subversion worked against her, because instead of Ruga, our orcish princess, having some manner of fault into why Elkith is trapped, or dare I say captured, by the orcish kingdom, we instead see Ruga calmly, carefully explain to Elkith that she didn't know Elkith hadn't agreed to this marriage, assures her that they won't force Elkith to marry her, and that Elkith will still be sent back on the first boat after the mandatory 50-day betrothal period is up. So of course Elkith, believing herself to be held hostage by this mean, evil orc who clearly doesn't want to let her go, who clearly put the words in her father's mouth when he told her that she had to marry Ruga or she would be disowned, sets about a fiery path of vengeance, making life a living hell for everyone in the castle who are no more responsible for her predicament than she was. It's just beyond frustrating to watch a brat make a living hell for innocent people, and then worse yet, for Ruga, our other protagonist, to be such a doormat involving it, allowing the Elvish Terror to get away with basically everything because, well, you know, I want her to feel comfortable, guys. When all that settles down, the story just becomes its big boring cliched adventure that the author said she didn't want to do, and doesn't become remarkable in any way. It's just an awful book, and I truly hope the sequels of this series is far better than this one. Number 3. Resistance, The Fall of Man, The Gathering Storm, by William C. Dietz. Striking again, William C. Dietz tormented me in my reading of Mass Effect Deception, a terrible book that understood nothing about its universe that it was in, and where I could literally make an entire video just pointing out the plot holes in it. Dietz, however, comes at me with another awful video game book, delivering unto me a Resistance Roundhouse, an interim book between games that's meant to explore lore and does nothing but disrespect the franchise it's in, even though I don't know much about the franchise, to be fair. Once more, failing to understand the characters within, we're given a book that is both boring and stretched to the absolute limit with filler and padding, creating a book that embodies the equivalent of trudging through a swamp of sticky mud. The smell of the book ain't so great either, to be honest with you. Prepare for a book that will literally weigh several pages on a character just standing in line, only to not even get what he came for. Prepare for characters to start receiving characterization with the promise they'll go through a character arc, only to be unceremoniously offed in a single sentence. Brace yourself for a villain whose plot makes no sense under the slightest bit of scrutiny, and a book that gives less than half a care that you might not have experienced the original work it's based on. I've heard Dietz is a well-respected and recommended author, but of the two works that I've read of his, I honestly fail to see it. Hopefully this coming year will prove me wrong, because I do have an idea to give him a final test. I just don't know if it's going to be worth it yet. Number 2. Patriots by James Wesley Rawls. Something that by all means should have been number 1 spot. Patriots by James Wesley Rawls is a libertarian power fantasy that describes the event where they're all just waiting for. When the US government collapses and they're free to grab their guns and kill anyone who comes under the land without recompense. Patriots, similar to The Last Layover, goes over a world following the aftermath of the US government collapsing, though this time from an economical collapse that destroys the government's ability to do things, and focuses more on the long term than the short term goals presented. We see the protagonist of this book over the course of 3 years as they live in the world, fending off biker artists, gay communist cannibals, and the worst one yet, the United Nations. And it's about as bad as you could imagine. Initially better than The Last Layover, only in the sense that the characters act somewhat like people who aren't cold-hearted monsters that salivated over the day they can just shoot someone without going to jail for it. And Rawls doing his best to at least make the collapse seem rooted in some manner of reality, it sinks fast. Because The Last Layover, for all of its faults, was always moving and always had something to at least keep my interest, for lack of a better word, in the book. Whereas this book just had long stretches of nothing happening, whether it be a near chapter's length of description for these totally awesome and definitely not crazy prepper plans the character had, or just in general, very little actually occurs in this book. After all, this book was written more or less as an advertisement for the author's own survival blog, so naturally speaking, the author didn't want to show any of the flaws in his obviously flawless beliefs. Even apart from that, it still has your standard libertarian power fantasy tropes. We get entire pages of backstory dropped on us on any character who's clearly going to become important for more than a couple pages. A military and a small town sheriff automatically means good, but them city cops and government, obviously bad. Characters so up their own ass that they can give themselves a prostate exam just with their nose, and a lack of self-awareness a lot of the time of why people would be against them. Seriously, if you have people hooting, hollowing, and stomping their feet for 10 minutes over a mediocre speech, which does happen in this book, sit back and just self-examine, please. Part of this may be the author keeps coming back and editing the book to fit with more modern times, but overall, it's just a terrible book meant to appease a group of people who will already believe anything that this book is saying is going to happen and just want to live out their fantasy they hope one day becomes a reality. It's so not worth the read. And now we move on to some dishonorable mentions. Before we dive into the horror of what is at number 1, here's some dishonorable mentions. Now, since I went with a whopping 10 worst books rather than 5, there probably isn't going to be much here. But these are the books that I could have put here for a variety of reasons. Whether it didn't quite meet the requirements, or maybe I just didn't think it was that bad on a look back. Here are the dishonorable mentions. The Dangerous Days of Daniel X by James Patty. This was a beloved book from my childhood, And returning to it, especially in the light of having seen what James Patterson considers good for his adult works, I was so disappointed and saddened by what I once considered good. If this hadn't been a book I'd read before, it would have easily taken the number 3 spot. But by my own rules, it had to be disqualified. Probably for the better. I can't rant all day about this. The Coming of Dragons by A.J. Lake. A bland, boring fantasy work, The Coming of Dragons was meant to cap off my year of more fantasy books, and did so by presenting me something that's hardly memorable or exciting. Almost feeling as though it uses our real-world setting as a crutch, it's uninspired, and makes several questionable decisions throughout its narrative. One I didn't bother going over in my review. An ice dragon breathes fire. What makes it an ice dragon then? Dead Until Dark by Charlaine Harris. A book that had good ideas but ultimately fails to tell them without fumbling or with less than interesting depictions of it. A terrible mystery, world building that has more holes than Swiss cheese, and painfully failed allegories. This book was one of those books I think survived by its adaptation alone. I've never seen True Bloods, maybe it's worth the watch, but this book didn't create the feeling that I should go and watch it. But with that being said, look, there's no more stalling, let's just get to it. Number 1. The Rising by Brian Keene. Look, it's no secret that this book was going to be number 1. Anyone who's watched my channel knows that. It's one of my most viewed videos in the entire channel. And to put a cap on it, The Rising by Brian Keene is one of the most offensively bad books I've ever read in my life. Starting off with an author note that basically gives himself all the credit for restarting the zombie craze of the early 2000s. The Rising of Brian Keene is just one... Crean, I keep calling him Crean, but The Rising of Brian Keene is just one of those books that I can't even think about without my blood pressure rising. What starts as a fun, innocent goal to review the first of a book that I was gonna read in my Spooktober TBR, and then jumped into its sequel with the same video, turned into me giving one of my most despised books, not only of this year, but just ever, a rating. The story of By Rising Queen is just one of those zombie apocalypse books, but honestly, it doesn't matter what happens beyond that, because Keene does his absolute best to horrify you with what you're reading in a way he doesn't even mean to intend. I had to put a lot of trigger warnings in my review of the book, and honestly, that's why I'm not going to dive too deep into why I found this book so disgusting in this review, in this list. I recommend personally just watching the video I put out to get a clear understanding of why I hate this book so much, and just get a full scope of just how awful it is. Because as far as I'm concerned, the less I have to actually talk about this book, the happier I will be. That's not even because my voice is starting to go out. It is literally just one of those books that I hate. If I believed in burning books, I would burn it. So yeah, that's the top 10 worst books of this year. Well, technically last year. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you got to see what I consider very bad of my year. I know a lot of these picks are probably pretty obvious for those of you who keep up on my channel, but hey, it's fun to make these videos. With that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and these are the adventures that you're probably just better off skipping instead of reading over second breakfast. See you later, everyone.